We good?
Okay. Thank you all for coming. I'm Megan Liberty. I curated this exhibition, Craft and Conceptual Art, that we're going to be talking about here today, and edited this exhibition catalog. I'm the art book section editor at the Brooklyn Rail and co-founder of Book Art Review, and generally write and think about artist books a lot. And I'm joined by Zanna Gilbert, who can introduce herself.
I'm a research specialist at the Getty Research Institute and kind of been accompanying the project, talking with Megan about it. And we equally at the Getty have a huge collection of artist books. If people are interested, you can sign up and get a reader card and come and consult. And they range from, older artist books and a lot of 60s and 70s to contemporary. I'm very generally interested in materiality and conceptual art, so we had a lot of kind of things in common. So we're going to talk about Megan's project.
Thanks all for coming.
Thanks. So we wanted to start, we're just showing a series of images from the exhibition. These ones were from the Center for Book Arts in New York, which is the first leg of the exhibition. And it's about to open, right, in Minnesota. So if you still haven't seen it and you need to see it,
go to Minneapolis. It just left San Francisco, so it's had 3 venues of Center for Book Arts across the U.S.
So we wanted to start off really by kind of delineating contours of how the project came about, what was the genesis of the project, why craft and conceptual particularly rather than other terms. So I wanted to start with that question, just where did this come from?
Yeah, it's actually funny. The exhibition came out of my work at the Brooklyn Rail, where I'm the editor, and I oversee reviews of artist books there and more broadly all kinds of art publications. And a friend of mine actually challenged me, this was probably 3 or so years ago, and asked me why we don't review more unique artist books in the Brooklyn Rail. And at first I kind of thought, oh, well, that's because, it's all about circulation and democracy and multiple. And then I started thinking, why is that true? Why am I actually not reviewing this more? And I kind of challenged myself to look into this and start thinking about, okay, are there unique artist books I'm missing that should be covered in this section? And I realized actually how hard it is to find and see unique artist books, how hard it is to get access to them in a lot of ways. And this kind of led me down this path about thinking about what other parts of the history of artist books I was missing that I thought I knew. And I realized that at exactly the same time that Printed Matter was founded was actually a nexus moment in the early 70s of a lot of other institutional organizations devoted to artist books opening all around the same time. So I started the project by thinking about these histories and these institutions and how they may have supported artists in creating these works.
So can you do just a brief just overview of this? I feel like this exhibition is kind of like a Mythbuster exhibition of okay, we have the received history and factions of kind of fine art, craft, production, unique books that you were talking about. And then this idea of the democratic multiple and circulation and cheaper methods.
Yeah.
And so can you delineate that field, as I know a lot of people here who are invested and involved in artist books might consider themselves in one of those.
In one of those camps. Yeah, so I guess I subtitled the exhibition Reshaping the Legacy of Artist Books because the way I thought about it wasn't thinking about these histories that we've been told, that basically artist books grow out of a democracy of artists wanting to circumvent the commercial art world and create books and art products that could be directly distributed to their audience, right? It's not that I wanted to say this isn't true, I'm going to rewrite this, but actually just think about if we take those facts, which are true, how can we reshape them to show a larger truth? There were actually a lot of other things going on at the same time of this moment. So a lot of the organizations I focus on in the exhibition catalog, which include Center for Book Arts, Printed Matter, Franklin Furnace, Visual Studies Workshop, the Writers Center outside of D.C. and Maryland. These are all institutions, Visual Studies Workshop, I could go on. These are all institutions that were thinking about different ways of supporting artists in making and distributing books, whether that be through a democracy of distribution or through just a democracy of materials. How do we give artists the resources to create books that are materially specific and materially driven, as well as idea driven and interesting, that can reach these audiences in new and exciting ways? And so I thought about it as reshaping rather than retelling, because all of these narratives that we've been told are true. They're just pieces of a larger picture. And I realized that one narrative had been kind of winning out over time. And I started thinking about why that might be and how we could kind of tell the story a little differently.
It's kind of interesting because it's like a more ample view that also then becomes more inclusive.
Yeah. I thought about basically when entitling it partially with craft, I thought about why we don't want to say craft in our history, why craft kind of is a dirty word. And right now we're in a moment where a lot of institutions are recognizing craft as an important part of our history and trying to bring it back into this space. But at the same time, there's a resistance to wanting to label something as craft. And I was thinking about why artist books would have aligned themselves with conceptual art and democracy of materials and idea-driven art as a way to make it into the canon of art history, so to speak, and what was lost, what was sacrificed by aligning themselves with conceptual art rather than also aligning themselves with craft. So in kind of curating the exhibition, I wanted to try to show a broad range of artworks and artists who were thinking about these same ideas about democracy, about distribution, about direct communication with their audience, but doing it in perhaps a more materially driven way at the same time as idea driven.
And then just to dig in a bit more on the craft aspects, it's kind of interesting to think about how maybe like the notion of conceptual at the moment in the 60s played this role of making things more radical. And now that you're like doing this historiographical exercise, the use of craft
is more radical.
And then you cite like Glenn Adamson.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about that use a little bit.
That's kind of funny. I actually hadn't really thought about that, how conceptual art was the radical concept of the time and now craft is the radical concept of the time. I kind of like that you mentioned that, and I hadn't even thought of that in setting this up. But so wait, bring me back to the question part of that. I got distracted by how I like that idea
maybe
so much.
You could talk a bit about how like Glenn Addison's ideas informed that.
Actually, so Glenn Adamson's one of the foremost craft people that's often cited, but the article that I kind of snuck into a footnote in my essay that I think is perhaps more interesting when thinking about the place of craft now in art history is Namita Wiggers, who was a curator in Portland at the Contemporary Craft Museum of Contemporary Craft that no longer exists. I'm probably botching the title of the museum. But she wrote a lot about kind of this moment we're in where institutions are thinking about bringing craft in. The Whitney did a show that included craft a few years ago. It's becoming very kind of trendy to use craft as a way to bring indigenous artists and, female artists, domestic makers into the museum space. But she kind of challenges that by thinking about whether or not these works are really being served by being brought into the museum. And it's something that I think about a lot with artist books as well, the way that when we place them in a museum and put them behind glass, that's when we give them certain kinds of value. Mm-hmm. When actually as objects, they have a lot of value as objects for use, as visual objects. And so it's interesting to think about this tension between wanting these histories to be recognized, wanting these artists and these communities to get recognition, but also thinking about how they may or may not be served by the institutional space of the museum.
Right. So that kind of takes us into questions of like the book as participatory and like why the artist book in this case kind of demonstrates the broader argument about craft and conceptual art. And like, do you see, are you like laser focused only on artist books, or are you interested in like rethinking conceptual art from this angle more broadly?
Do you want to show the diagram while I talk about this, maybe? We're going to see if we can stop the slideshow temporarily and show you one specific slide. So when thinking about, I am thinking about the relationship between craft and conceptual art more broadly, but this exhibition, I think, really shows how artist books are uniquely able to show this relationship. So when I was thinking about the relationship between craft and conceptual art, it's often presented, I think maybe if we just stay on the... Is this okay? Can you guys see this clearly? Okay, we'll just stay like this for while I talk about this part. But when thinking about the relationship between craft and conceptual art, they're often painted as these opposites, right? If you're making something that's super idea-driven, then you're not as concerned with materials, and vice versa. And I like, when we were talking earlier, you presented it as sort of like a mind-body divide, which I really like thinking about as well. But I was realizing that this actually isn't true, right? The more successful works will obviously deal with both craft, the materials and the making, and the idea-driven concept of the work. So I thought, okay, maybe they're not opposites, maybe they're on a spectrum. So I started with this kind of cross of craft on one side, conceptual art on the other, on a sliding scale, but the thing in the middle is unique and multiple, because just because a work is multiple doesn't mean that it's not interested in craft and materials and intentional making, and just because a work is unique doesn't mean that it's super focused on those things and not conceptually driven. So if I put these like this instead of like this, then what happens? And so that's how I started thinking about this kind of nexus of relationships between craft and conceptual art, and how the book actually is a perfect vehicle for this, because even when it's not an artist book, books are already a great merging of craft and concept, because they engage mind and body at the same time. We already understand this about books. They evoke something conceptually while we experience them tactily. And so artist books are really a uniquely placed art form to kind of have this conversation about the relationship between craft and conceptual art.
So I feel like that answers a bit like, you're kind of, are you saying that in conceptual art basically can be broken down in the artist book, or do you think like this relationship between craft and conceptual art still exists outside of the artist book, or do you think it's like this is the place where like conceptual art comes undone, right, in the artist book?
I don't know if I would say it only exists in the artist book. I think the artist book is a great representation of this relationship, but I'm sure there are other moments in other art forms where craft and conceptual art meet really nicely. Mm-hmm. But I think the book is best. I'm not biased at all.
So I wanted to ask you about some like particular examples that like demonstrate the thesis
this idea
of the exhibition, and you have a couple.
Number 9, I think. Yeah. So wait, go on 4 to 8. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So in the exhibition, I always put these two works next to each other. So on this ledge, the pink book on your left is a Barbara T. Smith coffin book, which is a Xerox book she produced in the early 60s. And then on the right, this fabric-y book is a unique book by Sass Colby, who's a Bay Area-based artist, and that is a book that also includes a lot of different materials. And so Sass is often thought of as being more of a craft artist because her work uses fabrics, hand stitching, and a lot of these kind of more domestic materials. Whereas Barbara T. Smith, I don't know if any of you actually saw the show of her work at the Getty that recently opened over the summer. Recently closed. Yes, recently closed, opened and closed. Anyway, it was recently on view at the Getty. But she is really known as a performance artist, so she would kind of traditionally be put in the camp of conceptual works. But I really like putting these two books next to each other in the show, so we can go to the next one. That was not the right button. Sorry about that.
This is probably going to happen again.
No. Okay, good. So this is Barbara T. Smith's book. I really liked the idea of putting these works together because they shared so many of these kind of similar qualities. So the story behind Barbara Smith's work is that she was kind of a bored housewife at the time, struggling with her kind of artistic awakening. And in order to produce work, she rented a Xerox machine and put it in her living room and started making prints of her body on this Xerox machine, using different household objects on this machine while her kids were at school. And this is what came of it. And I really like this image as well because she goes copy and unique, and I like kind of thinking about that kind of blending. And then I think I included, another page from the book. So it's a series of these, and she made a series of these unique works. This is actually one of the only editioned works that she mailed out to kind of announce this project to her art contemporaries to show people what she was working on. And so you can see she's really thinking about the materiality of the machine and her body in a very specific way that is performative and will end up leading to her performance work later, but it's also very materially driven. And then Sass's work, this is the, so big, okay. This is the front and back, there we go. Yeah, this is the front and back of the book, and it's so rich with materials, and it's funny because it kind of captures a similar moment in her life. It's sort of the end of her first marriage. She's making art. If you go to the next one. Yeah, this page is about the end of her first marriage, so you can see on the one side it's the new wife, and if that zipper, you unzip it, then she's behind it, and their child is going up in flames and crying and so sad, and then the next one. But she's using all these very experimental materials in addition to this stitching. So you can see these are self-portraits she made in a photo booth, and then she did photo transfer onto the fabric. So you see both of these women looking internally at their own bodies and their own selves and using the book form to do this, but from different approaches that are both materially and conceptually driven. So I love putting these two artists together, and I think they really kind of show the kind of connections I was trying to make throughout the exhibition of showing a lot of works that people who are familiar with the history of artist books will recognize the artist names, but maybe be surprised by the books. For example, I included a unique Solowit book from the Getty's collection, and maybe people didn't know that Solowit made any unique books, and a portfolio of stains by Ed Richet as opposed to the photo books that he's well known for, trying to kind of complicate just a little bit the history that we think we know by making these connections and showing these different sides of artists and their works.
Yeah, I when I saw the show, I really felt like I was like seeing a different version of the history that it's pretty entrenched. And I wondered if you could tell us all a little bit about how you got to the show, because it's an incredible amount of like archival research just to get to that point. And you also kind of got in touch with artists who have been pretty much forgotten. So that part, I think, is also really important because you brought back into view some artists who were,
not known.
Yeah.
So the research for this exhibition took several years, actually, and I started thinking about going back to kind of the initial question of why we review or don't review or think about or associate certain books with the narrative of artist books. I wanted to figure out what was actually being written about artist books in the early 70s. What were people saying? We think we know, right? But what were people being told about it? Because artist books were being introduced not just to other artists who are making books, but to collectors, libraries, the general public, institutions. Everybody was kind of trying to find language and understanding of what these new kind of creative modes of making were. And I realized that it's really hard to find out because a lot of these writings exist in, for example, Printed Matter used to produce sales catalogs that announced the books they had available. And these are now super rare, out-of-print archival documents, and they list all the books that they were selling. And I started going through these pages and seeing really the range of books they were distributing at the time and the different kinds of artists they were showing. And a lot of these book art centers were actually sharing their activities through newsletters that are not in libraries anymore. They're just in individual archives, and they're not kind of indexed on ProQuest or JSTOR. They're just in a box or in an archive somewhere. So I started thinking about reading these and these resources and how they really show the complexity of the narratives around artist books at the time. So I actually, in the catalog, reproduced some of these archival materials that are harder to find online, or harder to find online and in libraries if you don't really know what you're looking for, so that people can read some of these documents themselves and decide how they feel about what was happening at the time. And so I actually went to the Getty and did a lot of research with the wonderful collection there that you were mentioning. And it was a lot of these institutional histories that I was mining to find these early anecdotes of what an artist book was and how it was being shaped at the time.
I like how the show, is very focused on like the artist books and the work, but the book, it's like a completely separate project. It has then like parallel kind of institutional history and broader histories. Do you want to talk a bit about the 4 essays?
So the book, kind of the exhibition and the book are two sides of this project. As I mentioned, there's archival documents from some of these earlier institutional essays and papers, excuse me. But I also commissioned, part of Reshaping the history is trying to think about if a person just walked into a space, right, and saw a bunch of these works, but wasn't told anything about artist books, was just given some of these facts, seen some of these newsletters and documents, what would they make of this history without having that narrative in mind that has been kind of really entrenched? So I invited some people who are very familiar with the history of artist books, like David Senior, who wrote an essay for this book, to contribute essays, but I also wanted to invite people who weren't familiar with this history. For example, Tara Willis, I invited. She's a curator in Chicago, and she does a lot with performance and a lot with performance and scores and choreography and translating performance into book form is what she writes about. So I invited her to write about some of the works that are more performance-driven in the exhibition without having her know as much about the history. So we could get some of those fresher perspectives on these facts. I also invited Sir Rodney Sir, who was alive during this period and actually knew many of the artists who were included in the show and who were around in this moment, to reflect kind of on the idea of part of this narrative is like the urgency and ephemerality of the book, but actually, especially in light of the AIDS epidemic at the time, which many of these artists were impacted by, but actually a lot of these works have a very intentional permanence to them. There is a resistance to ephemerality. There's an idea of the book as a body that will outlive the corporeal body, in many cases that didn't survive. And so Sir Rodney Sir wrote a really nice reflection on his friends and contemporaries who he knew at that time, and what a crafted book and permanence could mean.
I love that kind of like calling into question the sort of doctrine of ephemerality, because that idea of like persistence and record is not one that's so much talked about in relation to works that we would normally consider ephemeral. There's been some work done recently in the field of like Latin American mail art on how the mailings acted as a kind of record of things that were occurring.
And it's so interesting that so many of the documents I ended up using were mailed documents. You know, the mailer catalogs from Printed Matter, the newsletters from the Center for Book Arts organizations, but they weren't meant to be ephemeral necessarily. They were about network communication in a sense.
Right. Do you want to talk a little bit about... it's kind of to go back to the question that I asked you about the research process, but you connected with an artist who was very unknown, through the process of the research. I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah. I'll share a very fun anecdote about how important archival research is and how exciting and lively it actually can be. So when I was looking through a lot of these archives, I found, I kept seeing a name pop up, Jackie Holmes. And I wasn't familiar with her work, but she was a female artist, black woman, who was making very materially driven work. And I thought this was very fascinating, again, because a lot of the narratives that were pervasive about the time, her work was really resistant to those. It wasn't overtly about identity politics. It was about materiality and mystical bookmaking, and really the book as a symbol and a totem and a body. And she made handmade papers. She sewed her books together. I was all in. I'm like, this artist is great. I need to include her in my exhibition. She was in the Coast to Coast show that Faith Ringgold organized. She was in the Dialect show at Franklin Furnace, which was a very important show of BIPOC artists who were all invited to make books, some of them for the first time, for this exhibition at Franklin Furnace, and a number of exhibitions at Center for Book Arts. So I started putting feelers out. You know, I'm doing this research. I'm in touch with all these institutions. I'm asking around. Camila knows this story. And I'm trying to find her, and nobody knows where she is. They don't know if she's still alive, you know. They don't know where she is. I can't find any of her books. They're unique, so they're very difficult to find. They're not coming up on WorldCat. They're mostly kind of art object-y books. Anyway, I give a presentation for the Contemporary Artist Book Conference with Printed Matter's book fair last year, and I talk about this research project and this research process and my successes and failures in the archive. And I share this anecdote of trying to find Jackie Holmes. And I sort of offhandedly, now this is a week before the catalog goes to press, also important fact, I anecdotally share this story and say offhandedly, if anybody knows anything about Jackie Holmes or her estate or where she is, let me know. I'm kind of joking, right? A month goes by, and I wake up one day to an email from her husband who says he watched my talk on YouTube and he can answer one of my questions. His wife, Jackie Holmes, is alive and well and living in Connecticut and would love to be in touch with me. So now Jackie Holmes is in the exhibition, her book, not in time to make it as an illustrated checklist plate, but we included a little footnote in the exhibition pamphlet. And so I guess this is just one of many stories about artists whose work is very present in the archive, is there, is part of this history, and is just waiting to be kind of re-entered into this history. And I was really excited to find her, and she came to the opening, and it was great.
I like that story. I think that, I mean, at the GRI, we sit on, like, huge amounts of materials that, like, really need digging into And that's like an invitation to
Yeah.
everybody to do more archival research.
I will mention one other thing I did in the catalog, kind of to use your phrasing as an invitation, is I included the call numbers to all of the books and archival materials that are in accessible collections. So as an invitation to all of you to pick up some of these breadcrumbs and look up some of these documents if you're interested, make appointments to view the books after this exhibition is done touring, and spend some time with them one-on-one, because it's really, these archives are just waiting for us to use. And this history is just waiting for us to reshape and reimagine and rethink and decide for yourselves if you agree with my diagram or if you think it should be a different arrangement of terms and words and phrases and artists.
And the book is actually a good place to start. I'm going to plug your book
Oh,
for
thank you.
because it has a lot of archival documents in it. That means that you can like go directly to this raw material and then kind of figure your own way through it. And yes, they're like the call numbers for some of the objects, but it can equally take you in other directions, I think.
Yeah. I also felt like part of including them was another way to, again, try to incorporate different voices. And I think people really like to see the actual materials of the materials, but it's also nice to try to incorporate as many different voices as possible. Again, I wrote the intro essay and I curated the show, but I'm just one person and I'm just looking at these histories and these objects and putting them together in a way that I think is interesting. But other people may put them together a different way. Other people may be interested in different or see connections I don't even see between these objects. So in including, reproducing archival texts, images of ephemera, images of the works, and inviting contributor essays, I wanted to try to make it as multivocal as possible. And I think that's also part of the idea of craft. Craft is about kind of a lot of community making and collaboration, and so I wanted the book to also include aspects of that.
That's cool. Did the Center for Book Arts print the book there?
No.
How was that done?
We hired. We outsourced it to be printed.
Okay.
But we worked intimately. I worked intimately with the designers on it, and Karina Reynolds, the director of CBA, was also very instrumental in the making of the book. So I'm really proud of it. It's really beautiful and exciting. And again, in an anti-ephemeral way, I hope it really lives on as another kind of piece of this history for years to come, so that other people can continue using it.
I have a question that I'm curious, because obviously any show is like a real process of whittling down. Would you talk about an object that for reasons of the theme didn't make it into the show, but you really wanted it to be there?
You didn't prep me for this question. I don't know. I don't know about reasons for the theme that it didn't make it in, but
you talked about Rouché's photo books. Maybe you like those books and they're super important in artist book history, but that's not part of what you're discussing. But I guess I'm interested. How did you make those judgments?
Well, I think two pieces of that. I can think of two books that I think are really important to this history that I didn't include: Madeline Gins's Word Rain and Michael Snow's Cover to Cover. Mm-hmm. I think are both really exciting, interesting artist books, but didn't quite fit the theme. Mm-hmm. But I think one other piece of how these actual artist books, 30-something books, ended up in this show is a lot of learning about the loan process, and how artist books live in institutions, and what does it mean when they enter libraries versus fine art collections. So I think there's so many layers to thinking about artist books as conceptual objects, but also as physical objects that exist in space. So I'm a critic, so I write reviews of artist books. So it doesn't really matter where the book is. I can look it up and I can go see it in a library, and it doesn't matter if it has light restrictions or it's really fragile or it has string, because I can write my review and then illustrate it and then it's fine. But for curating this show, I actually had to convince institutions that these books could go and be traveling for a year, and that was a very different process of dealing with these actually as physical objects in space, and then figuring out how they would fit together in the room, in the space, with all these different layers of needs, preservation versus use kind of restrictions on the works was really actually very challenging.
I can imagine. And then I guess this is probably my last question, but I wanted to ask you, I was really impressed when I saw the show that there were quite a lot of artists from Latin America. It wasn't just a US only show. And I wondered if you, through the course of your research, had any kind of observations about when you look more internationally, if these relationships between the craft and the conceptual like changes in different places.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I didn't necessarily intentionally include a lot of artists from Latin America. I was kind of trying to create a diverse cross-section across different aspects of diversity, so regional, ethnic, gender, all kinds of these economic. But it's interesting because two things surprised me. One, I had really no idea that Liliana Porter co-founded a print workshop program as early as 1964. That was really thinking, New York Graphic Workshop. That was thinking very similarly about kind of the relationship between materials, distribution, and publication, and made very crafty artist books that were meant to be distributed. So that really surprised me in terms of thinking about like pieces of this history and regional histories and why that maybe isn't as known. There's really only one big catalog on their work, and it posits that perhaps it is because of their different, that it was a group of Latin American artists, that it didn't really make it into the narrative as a larger piece of this history. But since the show has opened and been kind of traveling, I've received a lot of correspondence from scholars in France, actually, who are doing PhD research on artist books, saying that they are really interested in this exact question, but it's really not well received in Europe, and they're very excited about this project and wanting to connect with me on it. So it's interesting. I had no idea that that a similar kind of narrative exists more broadly, and that others are kind of grappling with this question in different ways in different regions.
Okay, I'm going to let this one last thing before I open it up to questions. I wanted to, like, a project like this creates so many new ideas and avenues for research, not just for you, but for other people, but where are you going to take it? Because obviously you've opened up like a lot of boxes, and now you need to...
Yeah. There were just so many artists I came across in this show that really are deserving of more research. So I hope other people will, look at the checklist and want to learn more about some of these artists and continue the research. But for me personally, I'm really interested in kind of trying the story I shared about Jackie Holmes. I'm really interested in kind of some of these figures from the 70s and 80s who were really producing on a high level a number of works, but whose works are really not known at all today. So I have a visual aids research fellowship, and I'm pursuing further research on Reginald Walker, who made unique artist books during the 70s and 80s and died very suddenly of AIDS, of an AIDS-related illness. And so I'm researching his books, and they're unique. So they're, all, again, presenting this challenge of how to find them and see them and get access to them. But he's just one of the many artists in the show that I'm continuing to work on, and I'm excited about ways of continuing to expand this project and think about other artists who fit this idea and this problematic fun tension between craft and conceptual art.
Well, thanks. Well, does anyone have any questions for Megan? Not for me.
That could be for you.
Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
One of the things I was thinking about that your project triggered, like the first few shows at Franklin Furnace in like 1976 were like environments where people were doing installation art with books, and they were like spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mostly women artists that were doing this, not exclusively, but the ones I'm thinking of, the first few shows at Franklin Furnace were like site-specific things, and like also like Alison Knowles' big book,
Yeah.
and other scenarios where the book is like exploded, or like the structure itself is presented as a space to walk into, and even like the Woman's House here as an art project, but then the subsequent catalog is structured as a building that you entered into. I don't necessarily have a question for you about that, but just in terms of like this concept, and then thinking about those kinds of like spaces that were being created at the same time.
Yeah.
As like explosion of the architecture of the book, or creating an architecture entered into, is like another.
It's another piece of it.
Moment.
Yeah. I wish that I could have included some kind of installation component, but it just wasn't possible with the space. But I completely agree, and I think that's also really ties to this idea of craft and conceptual art in that, like, we think about these environmental pieces as conceptual because we know they'll be taken apart. You know, they're an ephemeral moment, they're a performance, right? That's how we think about it. But at the same time, when we think about these book-related spaces, they are very materially crafted in that way that they craft the experience, they craft the environment, and they engage with ourselves as bodies and materials and haptic beings as well. So that's really exciting. And it's also interesting to think about Franklin Furnace, too, as such an organization devoted to performance. They actually exhibited a number. Oh, yeah, that book was actually originally the Carolee Schneemann, which was the card book that just scrolled, was originally a performance done at Franklin Furnace. I have a photo of the performance in the book and the cards. She would read the cards, which were all shuffled in different ways, and flash images that corresponded to the cards. And the cards were describing kind of a narrative of a dissolution of one romantic relationship and the beginning of another. And the index card format was very important to that, in that the way we remember things is always not really in chronological order. It's kind of this shuffled experience of memory and thinking back. But I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that at Franklin Furnace, which is known so much for this kind of experimental performance space, they were actually exhibiting a lot of unique artist books and really thinking about that. Jackie Apple, who was a performance artist, bookmaker, and curator at Franklin Furnace at the time, was really dedicated to unique artist books and thinking about their place in this history and how they relate to performance. So that is really interesting, and I was excited to learn that.
And Tara Aisha Willis's catalog essay in the book is really explores that question of like the relationship between performance and the page.
Yeah, and the page as a document, but also an object. And yeah, so there's a section of the exhibition that is specifically thinking about the relationship between performance and the crafted book. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed the very beginning when we were talking about. Sorry if you already talked about this, but I would love to hear a little bit more about your approach to how to exhibit these materials. Because, in most cases, there are multiples, and that there's like this durational time element to the bodily element to handling the books, and then you have to present it. If you're big in an archive, you have to present it under a vitrine that you're sort of like withholding from the viewer that original intent in order to show the material. So I'm just wondering how you negotiated that, if there were instances where you wanted to show the double of something.
Well, Camilo probably remembers all the time I spent arguing with him about all the books that needed to be under covers. Did they really have to be under glass? How could we stop them from being under glass? Is there any way that we could let people touch them? Camilo works at Center for Book Arts also, and worked with me on this exhibition. Thank you. So, I mean, yes to everything, and also it's very challenging. I think so some of the artists did produce facsimiles of their books that were kind of in a reading area. I was fortunate to get a few books from libraries that actually do allow people to handle their books. They're part of the collection that people can view, so they allowed people to handle the copies that were lent to the exhibition. I definitely don't have an answer, but I found that two things I tried to do as much as possible were try not to put things under glass even if they couldn't be handled, because the glass as a mediator of experience is really challenging. But I also really advocated for the shelves to be a lower height. I'm sitting down, but maybe I'm not very tall. And I always hate how when you go to exhibitions, artist books are up on these high shelves and I'm kind of peeking over. When we think about books, we think about them as something we hold close to our body. So I wanted them to be lower so that we could really lean over them and experience them in that way and create that relationship between the book and our body, even if we couldn't turn the pages. There's a lot of creative solutions with iPads and videos, but there's really no substitution for being able to turn the page, which is also why I tried to include the call numbers and hope that people will try to see the books on their own some other day. Yeah.
You should just have a generic page turner.
I know.
Turn as you look at the book.
I wish. That would be amazing. If they're open, I tried to encourage the people in the gallery to turn the pages every so often. So if you came back to the show, you would see a different page.
Any other questions?
Yep. Print and Matter has it on their table right out front. And good. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.